My law enforcement career started when I was 21 years old in Jasper, at Jasper Police Department. I was a night shift patrol officer. One of the very first calls that I ever responded to as a law enforcement officer was one of the worst domestic violence calls that I ever responded to in uniform. I think how it impacts your community, particularly where law enforcement and their response to domestic violence intersects with public opinion, is that when you have a community where law enforcement treats domestic violence as the crime that it is and handles it very seriously, that it's a reflection to that community of the significance of domestic violence. So your law enforcement response to domestic violence, I think, kind of sets the tone or the pace for how seriously people take the issue of domestic violence into consideration.
Just like with ADECA being a funding partner, law enforcement is also a vital partner when it comes to domestic violence, because domestic violence is a crime. It's a crime that needs to be prosecuted. We need strong district attorneys. We need strong law enforcement professionals, whether they're police officers or sheriff's deputies, members of a violent crime task force in a jurisdiction, even on to our judges, our circuit and district judges. They all play a role.
For a lot of law enforcement officers who deal multiple times with the same victim, multiple times with the same offender, sometimes there is a level of frustration because objectively, a person, much less a law enforcement officer, can look at a domestic violence situation and it just seems so obvious that this person needs to separate themselves for their safety and for their well-being and the well-being of their family from this person who's abusing them. I think it's important for law enforcement officers to realize that although it is so very evident to them that for a victim who is immersed in domestic violence, in the psychology of what abuse does to a human being, to their self-esteem, to their feelings that they can remove themselves from this circumstance, that it's very difficult. There are some valid barriers that prevent victims of domestic violence from exiting domestic violence situations. Sometimes it's their religious beliefs. Sometimes it's because they have a child who is dependent on a medication and the other person has access to great insurance. Sometimes it's monetary reasons. I mean, there's a host of barriers that prevent victims from leaving that are real and that for them are valid. And I think a consistent response from law enforcement that this is serious, that this is an unsafe situation, and there are times when they walk in the door and what they really need to say to that victim is, I am so afraid the next time I come here it's going to be a homicide and not a domestic violence call. When you're in it, not everybody sees it as clearly as an outsider does. And to help them work through the processes of deciding to go. The national statistics at one time were a victim leaves 7 times before they finally leave. That's going to mean they're going to have a lot of interaction with people that may very well be frustrated with them. I remember in the early 80s when I came into law enforcement that there was no place for victims of domestic violence to go. I can remember being on night shift as a very young woman at Jasper Police Department, and the folks on night shift, whoever was working that night, would put together $2, $3, $4, $5 a piece to buy a hotel room at a local, reasonably priced hotel for a domestic violence victim and their children to have a night of safety. I can remember when the shelter program system started in the state of Alabama. And in Walker County, ours started in a little tiny farmhouse that only had a couple of bedrooms in it, but it was a place to start. And all of a sudden, there was a resource for law enforcement officers. And it evolved from just a safe place to being a safe place with some opportunities and some really necessary services and resources becoming available. For me personally, as a law enforcement officer, one of the greatest things that came along is when victim service officers began to incorporate themselves into the process, the court process, into helping victims get protection from abuse orders and going as court advocates with victims into the courtroom, because it is such a strange process to people who are from outside the system. You know, police officers are not social workers. And police officers are expected to arrive at crime scenes and know how to do everything and handle everyone's issues and everyone's problems. And the truth is that there is so much that you can do at the scene, but you've got a call waiting, and it's the next call to the next house. And so what domestic violence shelter systems do in the state of Alabama is they are immediately a great and reliable place for you to hand your victim off to, so that you do your job as far as enforcing the law, but then you can feel good because you know there is someone to follow through with that victim that's going to give them the information and the resources that they need. I think the most important thing for a domestic violence victim to realize is that it does not have to be this way, that no one deserves to be treated the way domestic violence victims are treated, and that from a law enforcement officer perspective and from a legislative perspective, domestic violence in the state of Alabama, it's not just a bad thing. It's not just an unacceptable family behavior. It's a crime. And I think that when they realize that it's a crime that law enforcement and lawmakers in the state of Alabama take very seriously, that I think it helps them realize is that they have some folks on their side. No one other than the domestic violence victim can make the decision to leave. But there are a host of people in the state of Alabama that are working diligently to provide them with every opportunity and resource that they could imagine in order to accomplish that when they make that decision.